So today we're going to be presenting some of the updates from the LEAG ExMAG specific action team. Next slide, please. So at the request of NASA, at the end of last year, we formed this joint specific action team between LEAG and ExMAG. And if you don't know what those acronyms mean, they're on the screen. The overarching goals of this SAT are to provide assessment on issues pertaining to the collection, transport, storage, curation, and analysis of samples that will be returned by the Artemis program, not just Artemis 3, but beyond that. And also to focus on what happens to the data and its archiving from those samples. Next slide, please. So to achieve these goals, we were assigned a broad range of questions to investigate and assess. And so we formed 3 subpanels as part of this SAT. So one is volatile samples and cold curation, and that's chaired by Carl Hibbets. Nominal samples, which is chaired by Sarah Valencia, and then data archiving and infrastructure, which is chaired by Tim, who was the last speaker. Next slide, please. So each of the, in the fall last year, you'll have seen an announcement go out to recruit to the subpanels. And so through that process, we were able to populate each of the subpanels. You can see everyone who's involved listed here, and I want to call your attention to the names with stars. We have amazing executive secretaries, graduate students, and also postdoc who are really integral to keeping everyone organized and bringing also their scientific expertise. So we're really excited and really value their input as well as all the team members. We're also really glad that we have a strong ex officio group as well, including the LEAG chair and emeritus chair, and then our NASA headquarters liaisons as well, Sarah, Kathleen, Katie, and Robin. Next slide, please. Oh, and just to give you an idea of the cadence, so you might be asking yourself about the timeline. The first subpanels report is due at the end of, or in June. And so they're wrapping up the first draft of that report right now. The nominal subpanel sample subpanels report is due in Q3, so towards the end of the summer, September, we'll be getting that ready. And then the final report is not due till the end of the year. And the cadence really reflects the need for these reports by the Artemis program. So really volatile samples and cold curation is one that the Artemis team's really crying out for, that they need for building tools and things like that. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to give a really quick overview of where the volatiles and cold curation subpanel is at. Carl couldn't be here today, so I will do that on the group's behalf, but all credit should go to that group and Carl in particular for leading them. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this, I don't know what the 10s are, but that's okay. Within the volatile and cold sample charge, there are 5 key themes that the group has been investigating. And so theme 1 is what specific science is enabled by cold conditioned and volatile samples. Theme 2 is, are there specific activities required to maximize the likelihood of acquiring volatile rich samples at the surface of the moon? Theme 3 is, are there activities that are required to be carried out in tandem with sampling at the lunar surface? What measurements can or should be taken in situ at locations where potentially volatile bearing samples are collected? Theme 4 is about the community. So is the sample analysis community ready for cold conditioned and volatile bearing Artemis samples? And then theme 5 encompasses kind of more of the curation aspect of those volatile rich samples. And so in a moment, we're going to go through just a few of those themes, 2 and 3 and 4. Just to give you a flavor for where the group's at. But you can see that these themes cover science, sample collection, and surface activities, analysis, and curation. Next slide, please. So the approach, and Sarah will talk a little bit about this as well. The approach is very similar to also what Tim just discussed for the LEAG setting goals activity. We've been collecting input not just from the subpanels themselves, but also the wider community through looking at papers, through community surveys, through asking specific individuals to join our group and have discussion, and then also through email and personal communication. To give you an idea of what the report will look like, this is a bit nitty-gritty, but basically we'll introduce each of the subpanels will introduce their charge, and then some overarching themes or questions, and then we'll go through each specific theme, have a little bit of background and introduction to each of those sub-themes, and then go through the main topics, and then we're presenting findings based on our assessment. Next slide, please. So just quickly to go through some of these themes. So themes 2 and 3, we combined those because they really feed off of each other. And one of the key questions that Carl and Caitlin, who've been leading this, have been asking are specific in situ activities and measurements that are required to maximize the likelihood of acquiring volatile-rich samples and interpreting their science. And so as part of this activity, we've been soliciting input via surveys. And so here's a screenshot of just some of the expertise of some of the respondents that we've had to one of the surveys for themes 2 and 3. And you can see that we cover a broad range of expertise, which is great. We want to make sure we're really providing findings that reflect the broad interest and expertise of the community and our current state of knowledge. Next slide, please. So some of the specifics with regard to themes 2 and 3, we're thinking about some of the measurement and activities that could be done at the lunar surface, but also in the laboratory to provide context to the samples and their analysis. And so some of the measurements that we've been thinking about include understanding the composition via spectral imaging. The temperature, it has been a key theme that's propagated throughout this subpanel's analysis, has been understanding the temperature, the environment in which samples are collected, transported, curated, sent out for analysis and analyzed under are really key to interpreting the science. And then you can see a bunch of other measurements there as well about imaging and understanding composition. What's key is the finding at the bottom. This is an example of one of the findings from this theme, which is there's really a need for comprehensive imaging surveys of the potential area that will be sampled, including environmental information. I mentioned the temperature, but that's just one aspect, and near surface volatile measurements. So really collecting a sample cannot be done in isolation. There are specific measurements that will need to be done as well. Next slide, please. Some other things that we're thinking about in themes 2 and 3 are a preferred sampling approach for volatile collection in order to understand the science that's gained from certain samples. Contamination is another really important aspect, not just understanding the sources, but also providing mitigation from start to finish. So the materials that are used for collecting the sample, that touch the sample, that the sample will be stored in, all of those things matter with regard to contamination. And we've learned a lot of great lessons from the ANCSA initiative and also from OREX that are feeding into our assessment of this. And then information to be collected about the samples and the environment. And that, again, links a lot to contamination and temperature. Next slide, please. Okay, and then theme 4, we had a lot of community input on this theme about whether the community is ready for receiving the samples. And I'm running out of time, so next slide, please. We'll just get to the meat of it. So some of the feedback, we kind of split this survey into 2. So trying to understand what the community currently does with cold samples and volatile rich samples. And here when I say cold, I mean minus 20 degrees Celsius, because that's the lowest temperature that Apollo samples have been stored at and have been made available to the community. And so the finding is that the planetary science community has a history, has been successful at analyzing cold, curated, and volatile rich samples. What's not as well established is the bottom bullet, which is we're not really well established at analyzing cryogenic samples. And so the finding at the bottom there is that we're only beginning to embark on these types of analyses. And so there's a lot of catching up that the planetary science community has to do to really catch up to the terrestrial ice core community or glacier community. Next slide, please. Okay, and then here's some additional topics related to our readiness as a community. And I'll leave it there because I want to give Sarah enough time to talk. And I think Sarah's slide is up next. Okay, thank you. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Jess. So we are, as Jess said, we have a final due date of the end of September. So we are a little bit behind the panel that you just heard about. And I'm just going to give you an update on where we're at and ways to contribute. Next slide, please. As Jess showed our membership earlier, but just to dig into who we have on our panel, of course, we have Jess as the chair leading the whole set. I'm sitting as a vice chair, so I am leading the nominal samples panel. Then we have Carolyn Crow, Steve Alardo, Kelsey Preisel, and Nicole Zellner are our panelists. And then we have Alex and Bennett serving as our wonderful executive secretaries. Next slide, please. This is our approximate timeline. We are in that big blue bar of the information gathering stage. Right now, we are combing through community documents, inviting experts in to talk to us about specific requested documents or specific requested topics, and conducting our community surveys. So we're really digging into the meat of our work right now. And that's preparing us for, in about September 1st, we're hoping to have a draft to the community, and our final report is due September 30th. Next slide, please. We have two overarching topics. The first of ours is the analysis community ready for Artemis samples. So we are going to be looking at if we have, what facilities do we not have in the lunar community that we need to properly analyze Artemis samples. We're going to be looking if we have enough personnel, meaning both scientists and technologies, the folks running or technologists, the folks running our labs, if we have enough people to complete these analyses, and if those folks have the sustainable financial support needed to do this work. We're going to be looking at if there are significantly large research endeavors that need to be done, anything technology that needs to be developed, modeling, experimental laboratory kind of work, and beyond the normal scope of a research grant that needs to be developed in order to maximize the science return of the Artemis samples. And we're going to be asking if there are activities that are required to be carried out on the lunar surface to maximize the science of the returned samples. Next slide, please. The second half of this is that we're going to be looking at the curation and allocation practices for Artemis and the curation and allocation facilities as well. So we're going to be looking at how much of sample should be returned in magnetically shielded vacuum sealed. What are best PE practices? So we've been in contact with the OREX team, and we've been looking at the lessons learned from ANCSA as well, and of course Apollo, and trying to figure out what can be carried forward for Artemis. And we're looking at the current curation facilities and if they're adequate for Artemis samples, and whether or not a portion of Artemis unsealed samples should be curated under cold conditions. Next slide. And these ones are a little bit more lengthy, but we are looking at, are there any other non-standard curation conditions that need to be considered for a subset of the Artemis samples? And if the effects of Artemis processing on the effects of Artemis preliminary examination on Apollo sample processing time, and the curation, and whether or not the allocation process is adaptable for Artemis. And the last thing we're going to look at is how exactly should Artemis samples be allocated to the community? Should we be doing pre-calls for specific techniques, or doing consortia approaches like the ANCSA call, or just the standard process that folks use to request Apollo samples? Next slide, please. So ways to get involved. The biggest way we are asking for bulk community input is through surveys. I especially want to emphasize, if you receive a direct response to fill out a survey, please do it. That means we are specifically looking for your input. And we are looking to find out who we are missing. So all of our surveys have spaces for you to input who else needs to be sent this survey. We have 3 surveys that are circulating right now. One about surface activities to support Artemis sample science, one about lab facilities and personnel support for lunar sample analysis, and one about folks experiences requesting Apollo samples. And of course, we will have a public comment period of the draft in fall 2024 ahead of that deadline. Next slide, please. So I want to talk briefly about each of the surveys. The one that's been out the longest is this survey on surface activities to support Artemis sample science. So this ties back to our charge of determining if there are activities that are required to be carried out on the lunar surface to interpret the science of the return samples. So far from the survey results, some potential finding topics we found are that there's a strong community desire for compositional measurements made of a location before sampling. There was an emphasis on the importance of photography and videography taken before, during, and after sampling, and concerns about magnetic contamination of the samples. And if this is a survey you are interested in taking, the QR code is there, or feel free to email me. Next slide, please. The next survey is the community survey on lab-based activities to enhance science return of Artemis samples. So this is tying into both our facilities and the personnel in these facilities, and looking at what potential research endeavors need to be undertaken to interpret the samples. So far, our potential findings, and this went out over the Lunar listserv and perhaps a couple other forums as well, and we will be circulating this again quite soon. And this, what we're finding so far is that there's a community desire for a well-funded and flexible participating scientist program for Artemis beyond preliminary examination. There's concern in the community about replacing expertise as the Apollo generation retires, and community reminders that we need to look at our international partners as well because they possess analytical capabilities that might be less overburdened than some of ours. And there was a community notes that the support is needed for analytical centers with the needed expertise to analyze these lunar samples. So there are definitely concerns about funding. And if you want to take this survey, there's the QR code there. And the survey is being led by Nicole Zellner, and her email is there. And this one will go out over the Lunar listserv soon. Next slide, please. The last survey we are running right now, this has not yet gone out over community listservs, but we will be sending this out soon, or you can get ahead of the curve, and the QR code is there. This is going to be about lunar sample requests. So we are looking for folks, anyone who has requested lunar samples in the past, whether or not you were successful in those requests. We want to hear about your experiences. We're looking to find if the current allocation process is adaptable for Artemis, and what changes should be considered. And looking at maybe whether we need to consider more calls like the INCSA. Next slide, please, I think, or is that my last slide? Okay, and that's my last slide. Thank you all very much. Please feel free to email me with any questions you might have.